Why? Okay, bye.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Safi. I'm Vivian's grandson. I want to thank you all for coming. We wish we could be in person with everybody, but this is a good alternative for us and a good way to honor my Saba. I encourage everyone to leave a comment in the comments below the video to express your thoughts. I'm going to start by welcoming my Uncle Simon to say a few words.
Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate this. My dad is dead and I'm sad, but it's not a tragedy when someone dies at 92 years old. I'm so lucky to have had a father until my advanced age, especially one as impressive and sweet as he was. His remarkable intellect could be intimidating, except that he was so warm and loving that it was only impressive. Other kids might brag that their dad could beat up the other dads, but I could say with confidence that my dad knows more than your dad. As a kid, it never occurred to me that there were things that couldn't be answered because he had every answer to every question in excruciating detail. As we got older, he fostered that interest in knowledge for its own sake. The mantra in our house was, let's look it up. As kids, we were intellectually lazy and would groan, but we grew to understand and appreciate that there is no reason to leave unknown that which can be researched. One of his colleagues remarked, before there was Google, there was Vivian Rakoff. His curiosity and fascination was a hallmark of his life. No matter how much he read or achieved, my father's greatest joys were discovering new things and taking interest in the world around him. On the surface, people might describe him as a Renaissance man and an intellectual. But in reality, my father had the heart of an explorer or pioneer. Raised in a small town on the edge of the southern tip of Africa, my father still devoured every book he could get his hands on. His father, who was very smart by all accounts, but uneducated, sent his son to learn the things he never got to. An eidetic memory and unquenchable curiosity made my father an academic star. He went to London to study. He initially intended to pursue his love of literature and poetry. He was, throughout his life, a terrific poet. Instead, he was talked into medicine. His studies were temporarily delayed by a trip to Palestine, where he was to witness it become the state of Israel while working on a collective farm. Again, this small, deep-thinking boy was swept up by his enthusiasm for a new and unexplored horizon. His adventures were not those of a Hemingway or T.E. Lawrence, who enjoyed action and danger. Rather, he would look to explore any opportunity to experience something that would open his mind further. Even as a doctor, he pursued the relatively new field of psychiatry. After all, there are no new bones in the foot since the first textbooks were published, but the frontier of the mind was ripe with unexplored territory for a curious intellect. It also matched well with his natural compassion. He met my mother, lucky me, and although I wasn't there, I have now no doubt he knew very quickly that he had met a rare someone who could match his high mind and sense of decency. They married, had me, and decided to leave South Africa. Again, my father's pioneer spirit led them to the opposite side of the world. Canada was as far away as possible, but was young and open to possibility. It took time to settle and adjust, but with the addition of Ruthie and our dear departed Davy, we were soon a Canadian family. After a move to Toronto, my dad's qualifications and qualities led to a successful career as a doctor and educator. I frequently run into past students of his who tell me what a fantastic lecturer and mentor he was. His childlike qualities were always beautiful to me. My father would finish his dinner and say, "I ate it all like a good boy." He never heard the word shampoo without giggling and saying, "I prefer the real thing." When he was old, we would go out to lunch every Wednesday, just the two of us. I'd pick him up and we'd drive, and he noticed everything with childlike delight. He'd ask me to take him to Wellington Street to look at the dog fountain. Its whimsy and humor made him smile. And he'd sit beaming at toddlers who played with the dog sculptures and splashed in the water. He'd point out Arabic writing on the sign of a shawarma shop and say it reminded him of the path squirrels take when scampering. He'd notice every street artist's mural or funky bicycle. I remember laughing when we saw two young women wearing those trendy ripped jeans, and my dad said, "Oh, those poor girls." I explained that those jeans cost more than my intact ones. Of course, his greatest delight was the expanding family. Shabbat dinners were the highlight of the week. When Mika, Amit, and Safi were little, They'd have Friday night sleepovers with Saba and Savta. The ritual of them getting into their pajamas after dinner and playing golf in the condo corridor made my dad so happy. He would sit and draw anything they could imagine and tell stories he improvised on the spot. Once, when asked to play, he declined, and one of the boys said, "Right, Saba, you don't do things, you make things." He was equally delighted when Zoe arrived, and she adored him from the start, often saying to me, "Saba is so cute." She once chided him, saying, "You're good at drawing, Saba, but not good at the remote control." As the boys grew and towered over all of us, my dad would crow, "Look what I made." He took great joy in his life and never lost his appreciation for the luck and the love and pleasures of the world he made. Because of my parents, almost the whole clan from the old world now lives here and are thriving in Canada. They helped every one of our relatives to transition and never expected anything in return. My father taught me that we can grow up without losing our childhood selves, and we can be strong without being hard. He taught me the pleasure of knowing things and making things and loving wholeheartedly. I could not be more grateful. He will be missed by everyone who knew him, and I will think of him always. Thank you. Safi?
Thank you, Simon, for that. Next up, we'll have a dear friend of my grandfather's, Dr. Paul Garfinkel.
Why then, why there, why thus we cry, did he die? The heavens are silent. What he was, he was. What he is fated to become depends on us. Howden wrote these lines after John Kennedy's assassination. While today the circumstances are very different, we are also recognizing the anguish of the loss of a very special man and our need to carry him inside going forward. I met Vivian 51 years ago when I considered joining the psychiatric residency program at the University of Toronto. I was quite intimidated going into the meeting as I had heard him on the radio and recognized he was one of the finest speakers. He immediately put me at ease, and then he did two things. He discouraged me from moving to Montreal because of all the unrest in the late 60s. And he described the meaning of psychiatry. He said, like all of medicine, it is an art based on science. Conventionally, art and science are separate worlds, one creative, passionate, and romantic, and the other cold, rigorous, and objective. Not for Vivian. He saw both as driven by a passion for understanding. Both work for imagination and informed intuition. Fuse the art and science, he said, but never be wed to a single Procrustean model. I was so deeply impressed. I heard someone describe a vivid frame for a strange polarity of models for the field I was drawn to. I did two things immediately after our meeting. I signed up and I looked up the meaning of the word Procrustean. I have since been connected to Vivian for 50 years. He was my teacher, my mentor, my leader, my colleague, my friend, and my swimming buddy. 30 years ago, our swims were the highlight of my week. Though swimming was a small part of the outing. We would both go over to the athletic center or the JCC, do a few laps, and then follow this with a lengthy sauna, where he discussed his planning, priorities, and people, what Vivian called the chess game of his work. The walk back was the most interesting part. He noticed every doorway, roof, flower, squirrel, bird, and provided an eloquent description of each, drawing on his vast knowledge of history, art, literature, and science. He was the most curious person I have ever met. Once in China, I had to claim that I had a sore back late in the day just to avoid one more pagoda and one more temple. Vivian was a leader at Sunnybrook, the Clark, and the University of Toronto. His intelligence, curiosity, vast knowledge, and public speaking skills drew Toronto psychiatry into a new era. He was a leader, yes, but he was against a rigid centralization. You cannot assign a quota to poetry production, he said. For many years, he saw the future in terms of understanding brain function. He lobbied for a PET machine to study this. Then one day, out of the blue, he received a call from government. If you're still interested in that machine, we'll send the money over right away. We have a surplus. Vivian very graciously accepted the 10 million. This gift came with a real problem. $10 million paid for the machine, but not the 1 million in annual operating costs. Undaunted, Vivian and another visionary, Arnie Cater, set up a foundation to raise funds. Fast forward 30 years, and the immensely successful foundation has grown to build CAMH, the premier hospital for mental health and addiction. We evaluate our leaders by whether they have gotten the big things right. Clearly, Vivian did. His definition of the core of our field, his PET scanning triumph, the foundation, and his scholarly writing on Holocaust second generation and on adolescence. For these accomplishments, Vivian was awarded membership into the Order of Canada. Vivian also did the so-called small things right. His compassion for the disadvantaged, caring and concern for all outsiders, and the thoughtful gestures when someone was ill. The image that I keep in my mind, Vivian bouncing my youngest on his knee by their pool and singing, "Oh my Joshua, little baby Joshua." On a visit to Vivian and Gina 2 weeks ago, Vivian took me aside and commented on how rich and full his life had been. He was referring to his travels, his many experiences, and the people he loved and who loved him. Privileged, but not spared, the heartbreaking tragedy of losing Davy, their exceptionally talented and caring son. Sometimes life can just break our hearts. I'll always remember Vivian Rakoff as my teacher. Henry Adams wrote, "A teacher affects eternity. He could never tell where his influence stops." Vivian Rakoff will be deeply missed. Our condolences go out to Gina and the Rakoff family, but we have also all lost a remarkable man. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Paul. Next up, we will have another dear friend and colleague, Dr. Isaac Sakanowski.
Thank you, Seth. I've known Vivian for about 63 years. In the late 1950s, I was chief resident in psychiatry and neurology at Groote Hospital in Cape Town, when Vivian returned from London to join us as a psychiatric trainee. It was a unique time for the department. Concurrently, Henry Walton and Sula Wolf came, graduates from the Maudsley in London. Walton to take over as the head of psychiatry and Sula to concentrate on children. Later, by the way, Henry returned to Edinburgh, to Britain, to become head of psychiatry at Edinburgh University, and Sula became a world-renowned academic child psychiatrist. There were other promising trainees besides Vivian. for instance, Isaac Marx, would go on to the Maudsley and become a pioneer in behavioral psychiatry. Izzy Pavlovsky emigrated to Australia, ultimately became head of psychiatry at the University of Adelaide. But among this small group of would-be psychiatrists, from the very first, Vivian visibly stood out. In our tutorial sessions, he was spellbindingly articulate and creative in his thinking. He was a skillful psychotherapist to boot. Vivian was 4 years older than me, but already had a wealth of life experiences. Besides his medical degree, he had a master's in psychology and a strong background in English literature and the humanities. He'd lived for a year on a kibbutz in Israel and had shared gigs in London for about 8 years with other South African expats, including the future Sir Aaron Klug, prize winner, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, and the future Honorable Mr. Justice Lenny Crickler, a bewigged English judge known as Cricky because of his incisive legal decisions. Vivian had a fund of stories that he told with inimitable wit. We became friends and in due course were joined by Gina and Blume, our wives. A year after Vivian and his family emigrated to Montreal in 1961 to study at McGill, Blume and I went to London to study. Both families were among the young South African academics who were against apartheid and knew that sooner or later they would have to leave South Africa. In 1968, we were ready to emigrate. Among the possibilities was Canada. Nate Epstein, of blessed memory, was just then forming a psychiatry department for the new medical school at McMaster University. It was Vivian who filled him in on me and enabled him to take the gamble of bringing us to Canada. Our first night was spent under the Rakoff roof before we left the next day for Hamilton and McMaster. It was the first of many instances of the generous hospitality shown by Vivian and Gina, which later we were able to reciprocate to some extent. Later we learned that such warm hospitality was their hallmark, not just for strays like ourselves, but you could meet at their dinner table other academics and also distinguished non-medical persons. These evenings were memorable, not just for their excellent cuisine, but because of the scintillating conversation. They could never have happened without the warmth of the hostess, Gina, but the focus of discussion was usually on Vivian, a superbly entertaining host. Later, I witnessed the strange contrast. Vivian, as chair of psychiatry in Toronto, often grave and masterful, listened to respectfully by colleagues, and the lighter man in his own home who could rap like a rapper, recite poetry like an actor with a prodigious memory, and who himself had written at least one CBC radio play and was a master of English literature. By the way, it's no accident that the Rakoff children, Simon, Ruthie, and Davy of blessed memory, each showed such a strong creative artistic side. In 1984, we moved to Toronto, and Vivian, now the chairman at Toronto, became my boss. It was not necessary for either of us to spell out the separation between our roles in the hierarchy of colleagues on the one hand and friends on the other. I saw firsthand how Vivian knew intimately all the work staff at the Clark, from the cleaners up, and was personally interested in their welfare. I saw their special interest he displayed in the trainees and junior members of the department, and how he contributed to their development by example and encouragement and mentorship. By the way, it was a legend among the residents that if you had a casual conversation with the chairman, you risked coming away with an armful of books to read on that subject. Vivian lectured frequently in the classroom or in public, always with no notes and no slides, each presentation a tour de force. Because of his stature in the community, Vivian had access to sometimes large donations of funds to the department. He was generous in how these were allocated. Often they were used to fund research laboratories for others rather than for his own pet unit. That's not to say that he was exclusively altruistic in his professional activity. He participated in and wrote about such academic projects as caught his interest. As a character, Vivian basked in being the center of attention, which was often rightfully his, and he had a proper sense of himself. My friend Vivian, now passed into blessed memory, was a Renaissance man, multi-talented and gifted beyond the norm, witty and entertaining, kind, clever, and with a breadth of knowledge and experience. He will be sadly and universally missed by us all. Thank you, Safi.
Thank you for that, Isaac. Next, we will have Dr. David Goldblum speak, another friend and colleague of my grandfather's.
Thank you very much, and I'm really okay. I think I'm now unmuted, I hope. Let me begin by saying how honored I am to be included among those who loved Vivian and who are lucky enough to be the people who were in his orbit. I first encountered Vivian when I was a resident at McGill in 1984, and he came to Montreal to debate Thomas Szasz. This was my first exposure to him as an orator, and I can tell you it made me feel that English was my third or possibly fourth language. He had a lifelong case of amor verbis, the love of words. Nobody else used words like atavistic, autochthonous, zeitgeist, and elan with more, well, elan than Vivian. He always added an extra syllable to one of his favorite words, extraordinary, always pronouncing the first A in a way that gave it more gravitas and kind of verbal rubato. But it was not simply a matter of Vivian being silver-tongued. Vivian wielded it like a superpower to make a point, whether taking on Thomas Szasz or even taking on Barbara Frum in one of her illiberal moments. He expressed moral outrage and he was verbally pugnacious, but he was also capable of boyish delight and a juvenile humor that was the exact opposite of being stuffy. Vivian was not afraid to call things as he saw them. I recently watched an interview Vivian did 17 years ago with his former fellow resident from 1961, Ron Feldman. As they discussed the field of family therapy, the subject of the celebrated Milan group approach came up. Vivian paused. He looked at Ron with those big, unblinking brown eyes and said, "I thought they were Mishigoyim, cruel, nuts, not researched." He then went on to describe cognitive behavioral therapy as what doctors did prior to the establishment of psychiatry and what psychotherapists should have been doing all along. When I was in charge of organizing grand rounds at the Clark and then at CAMH, I invited Vivian to speak repeatedly. The generally assigned topic for Vivian was anything you want. And he rose to the task, speaking, as Saki pointed out, always without PowerPoint and seemingly without notes, or on occasion, a single index card. He dazzled us. He was a weaver of words and phrases into a rich tapestry that incorporated allusions to history, literature, art, music, and popular culture. And it was always an exhilarating ride because, like Space Mountain in Disney World, that roller coaster in the dark, it was only at the end that you emerged into the light of Vivian's destination. And after his lecture, if somebody asked, "So, what did he say?" you were flummoxed. It would be like trying to repeat precisely a jazz improvisation. Vivian spoke annually for several years at the Stratford Festival Shakespeare Lectures at the Toronto Public Library. Now, the other speakers were all English professors steeped in academic knowledge. But Vivian soared. He reflected deep familiarity with the text, a completely irrepressible thespian urge, and an ability to connect the words of the playwright to larger themes of humanity. He spoke movingly about The Merchant of Venice, and I remember once he showed me a gesture that he had developed for his own portrayal of Shylock in a youthful performance. There is, of course, that whole world of Vivian outside of psychiatry, including plays for the CBC going back to the 1960s, talks on radio, on television, and even on the stage of Stratford itself. When Vivian and I were last together at the end of August, we shared a scotch, some jokes, and some reflections. And totally contextually to our conversation, Vivian rallied himself to recite Richard III's speech, "Now is the winter of our discontent." And now that Vivian is gone, Hamlet's words about his own late father seem very apt. He was a man, take him for all in all. I shall not look upon his like again. Thank you.
Thank you for that, David. Next up, we will have Vivian's granddaughter, Zoe, speak briefly.
Hello. On October 1st, I lost my favorite person in the whole world, my Saba. My grandfather was the sweetest, cutest, kindest, loving man and person to ever roam this earth. I knew this day would come, but I never wanted it to. But alas, it has. My grandfather received the Order of Canada in 2015 because of his contributes to psychiatry. He was an intelligent man with many stories to tell from his childhood to his many travels. He cared for every person and everything he met. He was such a loving man with wise words to share. I am beyond lucky to have had him in my life as my wonderful grandfather, but also a close friend. I'll love him forever and I'll never forget him. I think of him every day. Thank you.
Very nice, Zoe.
Thank you, Zoe. Next, my brother, Amit, will say a few words.
I'll no doubt be scolded for paraphrasing rather than
quoting by all the academics likely in attendance here, but I'll do my best. In an essay that I'm certain my Saba read, Montaigne references a Roman perspective of how one should speak about these sorts of things, saying that one has lived rather than that one has died. And I think in my Saba's case, that is so true. In other words, death isn't so much the sad conclusion to a life, rather the inevitable destination of that journey. At the end of my Saba's life, he would ask me in his sort of iconic melodramatic tone, "Do you remember me before this?" Of course, referring to his physical decline, to which I'd respond something along the lines of course, I remember a time when I had to walk quickly to keep up with you. I'm so blessed to have so many incredible memories with my Saba, such vivid, real ones, and such a vast bank of them. From annual trips with my brothers and Safta, to Friday night sleepovers, Saturday morning matinees at the ballet, but one that really sticks out to me as one of my most cherished memories with my Saba is a time a few years ago when my brothers and my mother and myself got to take the 9-hour drive north of Cape Town to visit Port Nolloth, the small fishing village where Saba started his life and, spent his summers as a child with his brothers. And it was amazing to see the setting in which so many of the stories he told us took place, and to be able to put visuals to those words. And I will cherish that memory for the rest of my life. It is so precious. My Saba lived a blueprint for an impressive, wonderful life, but more so, he showed us an example of what we should live towards and what we should strive for. And we will spend the rest of our lives striving for it. Thank you, Amit, for that. That was beautiful. Next, my eldest brother, Mika, will sing a song that was one of my Saba's favorites. Well done, Amit. This is a song I wrote on a trip to Israel the summer I turned 16. And for my Saba, it pretty much made every other song I ever played kind of irrelevant. He loved this one so much. Je suis dans la lune ce soir. Quand j'ai déjà eu mon opinion, la vie n'est qu'un jeu d'exploration. Mais c'est seulement un jeu qu'on sait le percevoir. Vous pouvez le faire de votre manière. Mais je n'apprivoise que la mienne. La vie n'est qu'un jeu, si l'on comprenne. Et quand tu me suis dans la lune, tu deviens clair. I never knew your name. I never changed my mind. I didn't want yours. And I don't need your love. Je suis dans la lune ce soir.
m'assois ici sous les palmiers. L'esprit imite une rêve dans votre présence. Le pouvoir de l'amour dans mon âme, je veux en croire. On invente notre réalité. Et on se trouve dans une situation. L'image des étoiles, une distorsion. La façon dont je te vois sous la lune, c'est compliqué. I never knew your name. I never changed my mind. I didn't want your song. I don't need your love. Je m'inquiète partir demain. Mais je vois le désir dans ton visage. Elle va se souvenir des expériences. Et quand le soleil s'est couché, tout serait bien. I never knew your name. I never changed my mind. I didn't want your song. And I don't need your love. Je suis dans la lune ce soir.
Thank you, Mika, for that song. It's always a treat. Next, my mom, Ruth, will speak.
Excuse me. For many people who knew my father, he was a brilliant orator, a scholar, a professor, a doctor. He was larger than life in his professional and public designations. But to me, he was my father. He was both perfect and imperfect. He always had soft, dry hands like tissue paper to the touch, even when he was young. He had the oiliest head in the world, which left any pillow he rested on grease-stained. Kissing him on the forehead was like applying lip balm, both gross and somehow comforting. He needed to be reminded to clip his toe talons. He loved to be silly and do fake martial arts in the elevator when there were no strangers present. He was clumsy, a terrible dancer, the most inefficient swimmer, but he could draw anything. An ingenious party trick he could pull out to entertain children or doodle in a meeting. He was unequivocally generous. When he gave, there were no strings attached, ever. He worried a lot. The thought of anyone doing anything physical or sport related was cause for concern. In his world, it was always an accident waiting to happen. He was a morning person who had trouble understanding that some people, particularly adolescents, don't feel quite the same way. While I was in university, I would write essays at my parents' and slide them under the door of his bedroom with the rising of the sun, knowing that by the time I had had a few hours of sleep, there would be an edited essay back under my bedroom door. He never wrote for me, but challenged me to think clearly, get to the point, understand the nuance. He taught me to be a better writer, a better thinker, and a better editor. And he left me with a skill I could use to help my children with their essays. He taught me that if you owe someone money, they should never have to ask for it. He told us bedtime stories about his childhood when we were children, and he retold anecdotes from his life so often that we knew them by heart. He could recite Shakespeare, Yeats, Eliot, and everything else by heart, even when he really couldn't remember which day it was. He taught me the importance of demonstrating respect, particularly to people in service to you. When I was too young to really understand, he told me that one day I might actually be grateful for a predictable, stable, and boring life. He forgot to tell me there is no such thing. He loved his grandchildren so much, he always wanted to give them something, including his clothes, even when they grew so big they could fit him in their pockets. He was fortunate in so many ways, most of all in having married my mother, a woman of such great competence that he was afforded the immense privilege of living a life of creative and intellectual pursuits. He was extremely well taken care of by Gina right up until the end of his life, which was lucky for him because he was not very good at the mundanities of day-to-day living. He never really got the hang of using a cell phone. The computer confounded him. He couldn't cook anything except cholent, which he did perhaps a dozen times in his 92 years. My father could fall asleep anywhere, and did, though he often claimed he was only resting. I hope he is resting peacefully now. He loved chocolate, nice clothes, fancy ties, words, knowledge, Miss Vicky's potato chips, and me.
Thank you, Mom, for that. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in honoring Vivian. I want to thank everyone who's dropped off food, who's come by to say hello, who's brought flowers, sent their regards. And a special thank you to Iris and Adrian and Myra and Kathy for facilitating this entire thing. If you would like to make a donation in my grandfather's honors, please feel free to do so to CAMH or the New Israel Fund or Ve'ahavta. And we're going to finish with Kathy will do a Kiddush, but I just want to read a short Kaddish, a short poem that my grandfather wrote. If I could pour myself into you, knowing I've short time left, and warn you against the slackness of peace, a distrust of easy victory and small attainment, I'd ladle these truths into your receiving brain. But this is the arrogant desire of old age, which must retreat, sit tactfully on its hands, applaud your simple song, your stumbling dance, and let them grow as high as they may, unguided by querulous reserve. Forgive me, it's late in the day, I must retreat and dully pray. Thank you, everybody. I'm now going to pass it to Kathy for a Kaddish, and then we'll finish with a slideshow.
Thank you, Safi. Because of COVID, we have been deprived of so many of our comforting rituals, but please join me now in saying the Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shmei Rabbah, be'alma divra chirutei ve'amlich malchutei, b'chayichon u'vyomechon u'v'chayei trol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah b'morach v'le'olam be'alma u'amaya, yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitraman v'yitnaseh, Vitadar, Vitalel, Vitalal, Shmed Kudisha, Berichu, Leela min kol birchata v'shirata, Tush b'chata v'nechamata, Damiram be'alma v'imru amen. Yehi shlama Rabba min shemaya, V'chaim aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Ose shalom b'mrumav, Huya ase shalom, aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. May the source of peace send peace to all who mourn and comfort to all who are bereaved. And together we say, Amen.
Yeah, they switched to that. It's nice.